سلام، به هانیکاست خوش اومدید. گفتگوی این بار من در هانیکاست با یکی از پربحث برانگیزترین چهره‌های سیاست خارجیه، تریتا پارسی. فردی که اظهار نظرات ضد و نقیضی دربارش وجود داره. یه عده میگن طرفدار جمهوری اسلامی و یه عده تحلیلگر سیاسی مستقیم میدونن. حالا بیا تا از زبان خود تریتا پارسی نظرش رو بشنویم. اگه به گفتگوهای جنجالی علاقه‌مندی کانال منو ساب کن و همراه من باش.
A lot of people have heard your name, but they don't really know who Trita Parsi is. If you had to describe yourself to my audience in one sentence without slogans, who are you and how should people understand you?
So I'm an academic and co-founder of the Quincy Institute, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C. that advocates for a very different type of an American foreign policy, one that is centered on restraint, military restraint and diplomacy, rather than the previous or the current grand strategy of the U.S., which is based on hegemony and domination. Prior to this, for 17 years, I was also the president of the largest grassroots organization for Iranian Americans in the United States, the National Iranian American Council. I was born in Iran, but I grew up in Sweden and in the United States.
How long have you been living out of Iran?
Since the age of 4, so what is it now? More than 46 years.
All right. So because here is a conversation of questions are unlimited and we want here to speak completely directly and clearly and without any limits. I want to ask about the rumors about you. For years, there have been rumors, true or false, about your closeness to Iran's foreign policy system and specifically to Mohammad Javad Zarif. Many say you're essentially an Islamic Republic's lobbyist in Washington. How accurate is that? And should you even be considered a lobbyist?
It's completely inaccurate. I'm not a lobbyist, and nor am I in any way, shape, or form allied with any entity inside of Iran or in any other country. What I have done, though, is to try to make sure that a war between the United States and Iran is evaded, and that diplomacy between the two countries can bring forward a better future for both, that brings Iran out of its isolation, lifts sanctions that have been devastating for Iran, but also a foreign policy that is more valuable to the United States. I don't think it is valuable to the United States to have this unnecessary confrontation with Iran.
Mhm. Mr. Parsi, whenever your name comes up, so do others, like Hushan Amir Ahmadi, Vali Nasr, and Farnaz Basihi, along with the claims about influential networks in the US and Europe. Do you confirm or reject that you are part of a coordinated media political network or an Iran narrative cartel working in sync to shape Iran's image in America?
Yes, I reject all of those different things. These are some people that you mentioned I'm not even in touch with, and there's no such thing as a network. But what you have are various individuals. I'm not speaking for any one of those individuals, but there are individuals who, because of their academic position or because of their role in media, etc., are presenting their own views on various matters. And whether that is to shape the image of Iran outside of the US or other things differs from different people, of course. But bottom line is, in my specific case, as I've explained, I run a think tank, I ran an organization that had a very transparent mission, which was to make sure that the United States and Iran did not end up in a war, that they solved their problems diplomatically, that they brought Iran out of isolation, lifted sanctions, and pursued an American policy that was also better for US national interest. Now, you have in Iran, you have in the US, you have in Israel elements who benefit from confrontation, who benefit from sanctions, who benefit from Iran remaining isolated or getting even more isolated. And their way of fighting for what they think is right has been to spread rumors about everyone who may or may not disagree with them on some of these different points. That's part of the reason why you have so many different rumors. It's interesting that you don't have rumors about the others who are pushing for isolation, etc., because those who have been pushing for a peaceful solution have not engaged in spreading rumors of that kind.
Interesting. You and people in your circle were highly influential in shaping the U.S. perception of Iran especially during the JCPOA era. If we assume the nuclear deal has effectively collapsed today, which it did actually, what part of that failure do you think belongs to your side?
I think there were many challenges with the JCPOA, but I also think it's very important to recognize that no one at the time in the United States, in Iran, or in Israel, or in anywhere else that had influence predicted that Donald Trump would become president of the United States. So the very idea that the US would pull out of the agreement in the manner that it did was simply not on anyone's radar at the time. And I think everything that has happened is a direct consequence of that. That doesn't mean that there weren't challenges with the JCPOA. There were things that, in my view, could have been better. I would have preferred to see a larger deal that also ensured that US primary sanctions were lifted. Because I think it's clear now that secondary sanctions without primary sanctions relief really isn't that effective. I think it would have been better if the deal had been reached a little bit faster. So while Obama was still president, we could see the implementation of it and make sure that it would have stuck and been stronger so it wouldn't be as sensitive as to the potential whims of the next president, who no one knew exactly who that person was going to be. So I think there's a lot of things with it that certainly could have been done differently. But the idea that the US pulled out in the manner that it did, I think took everyone by surprise, including the many, many critics of the JCPOA in the US or in Iran itself.
Mhm. In your view, who made the biggest mistake in the JCPOA, Iran or the US? And was the entire idea doomed from the first because it was too idealistic?
I don't think it was too idealistic. I think that at the end of the day, there were certain things that could have been made in order to make it stronger and to make sure that the US cost for withdrawing would have been higher. One of those things was to make sure that actually primary sanctions were part of the JCPOA. If primary sanctions had been lifted, that would have then enabled direct trade between the US and Iran. This was not provided by the JCPOA. Had there been direct trade, and had that trade taken place for 2-3 years before the next president came in, then I think you would have a different scenario in which the political factions in the United States that would have resisted a pullout from the JCPOA would have been much stronger than what they were. But you can also take a look at all kinds of other agreements right now, and you can see that with Donald Trump, you have a very, very different kind of a president, one that no one predicted, who just pulled out of things left and right. He pulled out of the Paris Agreement, for instance. Was it a mistake to negotiate the Paris Agreement just because Donald Trump pulled out of it? I don't think it was. You have to be able to pursue various agreements. Now, you have to try to make them as strong as possible so that principle powers such as the US don't pull out. But what you had with Donald Trump is someone who, that on several different areas pulled out of agreements. He's even said that he may not want to stay in NATO and question Article 5 in NATO. So to then pin all of that and say that that was this unique error of the JCPOA, I think is rather simplistic, mindful of the fact that you have an actor that has done the same thing on many other issues, not just the JCPOA.
Mr. Parsi, you're often described as having played a major role in advancing the nuclear agreement under Obama. But there is another narrative that Obama era sanctions built the very pressure today that we have because of sanctions. Democrats, critics say, only differed in tone, so there's not much difference between them and Republicans. If that's the case, what real progress happened under Obama on the nuclear program?
So I don't agree with the premise of your question.
Mhm.
First of all, the fundamental sanction structure that ended up being very painful for for Iran was put in place during the end years of the George W. Bush administration. That's when the financial sanctions were put in on Iran. Under Obama, through Congress, you had specific sanctions that were advanced and were adopted in the years between the initial phase of diplomacy, which was 2009, and the latter phase of diplomacy, or the second phase of diplomacy that was successful. So essentially talking about 2010 to 2012. Those sanctions were undoubtedly also very painful for Iran. What you had, however, afterwards is what the Trump administration did during the Trump 1 era under maximum pressure. That's when you see the United States not just going with certain mechanisms, but with a much, much stronger coercive approach towards forcing other countries to abide by American sanctions. And this is where you see the squeeze on the Iranian economy being much, much greater than it was during the time of Obama. Now, can you say that some of that was built on what Obama did? Yes, some of what Obama did was built on what had been done prior to that during the Bush years. But one of the critical things happens is when they start doing financial sanctions, and that was under the Bush administration. So, were there differences between the Republicans and Democrats? I wouldn't want to exaggerate them, because I do believe that by and large, both of them are approaching the world through the same grand strategy. There are nuances and shapes and changes within that. But on Iran specifically, I think it is quite disingenuous to say that there wasn't a difference between Bush, Obama, and Trump later on. Because at the end of the day, under Obama, there was an agreement. Under Obama, once the agreement was signed, the US was actually pushing for Iran to be included on the talks on Syria. So you actually had for about 2 years an end to a 40-year policy of completely containing and isolating Iran. That happened under Obama as a result of the JCPOA for 2 years. Unfortunately, it was only 2 years, because then Trump comes in and he reverses it. But that actually was very significant. Had it been given more time, I think it would have been much, much clearer to people how significant and historic that shift was. It is, of course, a complete shame that it ended. And as a result, perhaps people are not seeing what the significance of that shift. But that was a very, very significant shift. I think it's fair. I think there's a tendency in Iran to really look at things from a Democrat-Republican perspective. Sitting in Washington, increasingly no one looks at it that way. It's because when you take a look at the policy of the Biden administration, in some ways it was more similar. In fact, in many ways, it was far more similar to Trump's Iran policy than it was to Obama's Iran policy. So that it's more important to focus on the administrations themselves than necessarily thinking, well, these guys are Republicans, and as a result, they're this way. These guys are Democrats, and as a result, they're this way.
Okay, so now let's get to this time right now. You've seen the U.S. decision-making process up close. From your perspective, how is Abbas Araghchi viewed right now? Is he more of a coordinator or a negotiator? Washington still takes seriously. And what would you say is his strongest asset and his biggest weakness?
I can't comment on specific perceptions that any decision makers have in the US about Foreign Minister Araghchi's performance. What I think is interesting is that compared to previous eras, where diplomacy oftentimes was personalized, or there was a lot of debate inside of the US about different factions in Iran, etc. You're not really seeing that from the Trump administration. They're not talking about different factions in Iran. They're not going into the details of making differentiations between, is this foreign minister with this camp, or is that other person from that other camp? Is this because of a lack of knowledge, because of a lack of appreciation for the nuances, or is it because of other reasons? I can't give you an answer to that, but I can tell you that on the earlier eras, there was a lot of commentary, and sometimes even US officials would, in private settings, speak of Iranian diplomats or decision makers. I'm not seeing that right now at all. There doesn't seem to be much of a focus on any specific individual when it comes to the Trump administration's approach.
What about your personal view about him?
I have not been in negotiations with him, so I cannot speak to that. What I can speak to, though, is the general approach of Iran right now, which is not something that is solely in any way, shape, or form decided by Foreign Minister Araghchi, but is decided by the system as a whole. I think Iran currently is committing a mistake. I think it is still pursuing a nuclear negotiation, whereas from the US's side, from Trump's side, he is of the view that he has already resolved the nuclear issue. And as a result, if there is to be a negotiation, it has to be something that is more than just a nuclear issue. That does not mean, however, that broader negotiation has to be about missiles or regional groups or other things, which I understand from the Iranian perspective, it would be somewhat foolish to accept negotiations on, because these are the last elements of Iran's deterrence at this point. But it's the fact that if you take a look at the psychology of Trump, he's looking for big wins. He's looking for things that puts him in the history books. Even when he does things that are hardly a peace deal, he calls it not only a peace deal, he says that he's ended 3,000 years of conflict with his peace. Clearly a huge exaggeration, if not a straight out falsehood. But that is his psychology. He's looking for something big. Negotiating about a 6-month extension of snapback does not capture Trump's attention or imagination. Negotiating even on the nuclear issue, I don't think captures his imagination or attention. But if Iran were to negotiate, not just on the nuclear issue, but also to end 45 years of US-Iran enmity and reach to some sort of a state of peace with the US, that's where I think you suddenly would actually get some attention from Trump, and something that he then not only would be interested in, but perhaps most importantly, that's where I think you will see Trump show flexibility on other issues, including on the nuclear issue. But if the negotiations is just on the nuclear issue, then it ends up becoming a zero-sum variable. And if it's zero-sum, Trump is going to take a maximalist position, which is exactly what he's doing right now. He's demanding zero enrichment. Iran, to the best of my understanding, will never accept that. But as long as that is the only variable of negotiations, the two sides are going to be stuck. I think in Tehran, perhaps there is a fear that expanding the agenda would perhaps put Iran in a disadvantage. I think the likelihood is the opposite, that if you expand the agenda to actually do something that only Iran can offer. You know, earlier on in the negotiation, Iran was dangling the idea of $1 trillion business opportunity for the US. I think that was correct. But that is not the only thing, that's not the thing that only Iran can offer. The Saudis can offer much more on that. The only thing Iran can offer, that solely Iran can offer, is peace between the United States and Iran. No one else can offer that. And to use that as a way of, first of all, getting all of these sanctions lifted, ending Iran's isolation, but also finding a reasonable solution on the nuclear issue that retains Iran's deterrence and its honor, I think is a smarter way of going about this. I think the more narrowly focused, the more zero-sum it becomes, the more maximalist Trump becomes, and the less the chances are of actually getting any deal or even getting a negotiation.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Parsi, I think the problem, the issue is more fundamental than what we all think. Because Donald Trump repeatedly claims the US destroyed Iran's nuclear program in the war between Israel and Iran. So if that's true, then why hasn't the US lifted nuclear related sanctions at any point? Then what's the deal?
That's a very fair contradiction that you're pointing to in his position. And if you're sitting here in Washington, you would see that on almost every policy Trump pursues, there are massive contradictions. And he is totally happy having tremendous amount of contradiction. He's not bothered by having contradictions. But you're absolutely right. If the program is entirely obliterated, one could make the argument that the sanctions should be lifted. Then again, of course, Iran has not said that it is going to stop enrichment. So the US side will probably turn around and say that, well, as long as Iran is not stopping enrichment, why should the sanctions be lifted from the American standpoint? Bottom line, again, I think your question actually gets to the earlier thing I was saying. If the negotiation is just on the nuclear issue, it very quickly becomes zero-sum, and then both sides are going to take positions that are extremely inflexible, and this On the side of the US, these are clearly maximalist positions that will not go anywhere. And frankly, I fear will drive this issue towards another military confrontation.
Mhm. So, considering, because I mentioned that in my previous question, considering Israel's strike on Iran in the middle of ongoing talks, and given the U.S. posture plus a decade-long deadlock around the JCPOA, do you believe meaningful negotiations is still possible?
I think so. And first of all, I have to say, I fully understand that from the Iranian perspective, having had this experience, I understand that there may be zero appetite for any negotiation with the United States. Iran, in my view, engaged more frankly, more directly, and showed greater flexibility than at any other point in the 20 years that this negotiation has been taking place. And it ended up with the US greenlighting Israel striking Iran. So I fully understand from the Iranian side why there may be absolute zero appetite for negotiations. The question one has to ask oneself still is, if there are no negotiations, what will happen? What is the alternative? And there I fear that unless something is achieved diplomatically, then we are going back towards some sort of a military confrontation. This is not an issue that for 3 years will remain dormant and can be ignored. I fear that it will blossom up again. Exactly when is difficult to tell. And as a result, the idea of just not negotiating for 3 years, to me, doesn't sound like an attractive option. Moreover, what is the guarantee that the next American president will not adopt an even more hawkish position?
Exactly.
What is the idea? So for how long is negotiations going to be deferred? For how long should Iran live under these different sanctions that slowly and surely is destroying Iran's economy? Even though Iran can muddle through, doesn't mean that Iran is living up to its full potential. Looking at how Iran's economic outlook has fared in the last 20 years and seeing how, for instance, Turkey, who had a smaller economy than Iran in the year 2000, is now a G20 country. Extrapolate this for another 20, 30 years, and Iran will be at the level of Afghanistan. How is that a winning strategy? So I think that I've not seen any argument as to how diplomacy can forever be deferred. And then one has to ask ourselves, with all of the different qualities, positive and negative, that Trump has, there is one that we have never seen in any other American president, not even in Obama, which is an actual desire to make peace with Iran. Now, perhaps he's thinking of it on terms that are unacceptable to Iran at this point, but even previous presidents would not make peace with Iran even under the best of terms. It was simply not an attractive thing. For them, negotiating with Iran was something they did out of necessity, not out of a desire of moving beyond this enmity. With Trump, you have something completely different. He relishes in the idea of being able to be a peacemaker. Now, we haven't seen him really make peace anywhere, but nevertheless, he wants to strike deals, which in previous presidents, again, has been the main problem. That Iran actually had to build a nuclear program to get on the agenda of the United States, get to the attention of the United States in order to get the US to even come to the negotiating table. But now with Trump, you actually have someone who can be extremely flexible in order to get a deal, but also can then give a green light for military strikes. So the spectrum is 180 degrees. It can go all this way or all that way. The next American president will likely not be that. The next president will likely be much more worried about the political costs he or she will pay at home, particularly with pro-Israeli interests, if he or she engages in diplomacy with Iran, let alone actually strikes a deal with Iran. So you have, in the next 3 years, a situation in which things can go all the way towards another war, but it can also potentially go all the way towards a fuller agreement. Whereas with the next president, I think we're going to go back to what you had under Biden, most likely, which is he would not make a deal, he would not go to war, but he would just retain a very negative status quo, but that surely and slowly was weakening Iran. So if Iran wants to get out of this current situation, it needs a president that is also willing to make a deal. And in Trump, that is still the case, given nevertheless, all of the other negatives that come with the manner that he's doing things, including a very perplexing negotiating style in which he chooses people who may not even know the substance of these issues very well. He has a negotiating style that is more fitted for real estate in Manhattan than international politics. But nevertheless, he's also coming at it with a desire to make a deal, whereas previous presidents simply did not have that.
Another issue is increasing the tensions. Thinking and worrying about who's going to be the next president of America is one issue. And the other thing is, if tensions between Iran and Israel spiral out of control, what's the real scenario you see unfolding? And at what point and in what way does the United States step in, actually?
I do think there is a very significant risk that the Israelis will attack Iran again, regardless of what happens on the nuclear program. They will do so because the broader Israeli goal is to reduce Iran into the next Libya, Lebanon, or Syria, a country that is completely under the domination of Israel's military hegemony, a country that Israel can strike at will with impunity without American involvement. Israel clearly is not at that point right now. It could not defend itself without the help of the US, and even with the help of the US, it could not defend itself against Iran's missiles. But having started this process, the Israeli calculation is that they cannot afford to stop because they believe they have a window with the weakening of Hezbollah. And if they do not strike again, then Iran will have enough time to rebuild itself, rebuild Hezbollah, rebuild its deterrences, rebuild its air defense system, perhaps buy better ones, and the window will close. So I think the Israelis are, from a military standpoint, the logic for them to attack again, unfortunately, is very clear. Whether military readiness, political opportunity, etc., is available remains to be seen. Once we enter the US's midterm elections, will that make it more difficult for Israel to attack, or will it actually make it easier? It's not entirely clear. And then the question comes to, what will the US's role be in that type of a war? Will the US continue to defend Israel as it did, not only in the 12-day war, but also during the attacks of April the year before? One thing that is quite interesting is that the level of support the US provided Israel in April was higher than it was in October, and was higher than it was in June of 2025, meaning that the level of support the US provided kept on going down. But of course, it was still providing that support. And it's not entirely clear what the US would do in that type of a situation. Would the Israelis be able to push even Trump, who otherwise says that he doesn't want to have war? And in his mind, I think it's important to understand that what he did with Iran was not war. It was one military action. That's his way of looking at things. Of course, others would strongly disagree. But a broader war doesn't seem to be something that would be supported by the America First constituency of Trump, but it's completely unclear and rather unpredictable. And this is unfortunately part of what Trump wants. He wants himself to be completely unpredictable. Iran has to then design its strategy in accordance to that. And again, I go back to what I said earlier on. It's precisely for these reasons that I don't believe that diplomacy can be deferred even 3 years. And even if it could, what are the reasons to believe that it could be easier after Trump? ببخشید من الان فقط 1 دقیقه بیشتر وقت ندارم.
خواهش می‌کنم. من دو تا سوال دیگه دارم، یعنی تقریبا سوالام تموم شده. سعی می‌کنم که خیلی خلاصه بپرسم ازتون و شما خلاصه جواب بدید که وقتتون گرفته نشه. Okay, I just, as we're walking on the timeline in our conversation, I want to go back to many years ago about the 2009 Iranian election crisis. Barack Obama later said his lack of support for Iranian protesters was a mistake. There's been a claim that you advised the administration on Middle East issues at that time. So what exactly was your role, and why did Obama choose such a minimal response?
Well, back then, the reason why Obama at first was saying very little about the elections was because behind the scenes, it had become clear to the US's attention that the Iranians had asked for nuclear fuel pads of the IAEA. And they saw that as an opportunity to see if they could strike some sort of a deal. So as a result of his focus on a deal at first, he remained rather quiet on that issue. Now, of course, he later on condemned human rights violations, etc. But he also did not want to get entangled in making a determination of who had won or who had lost the elections. Some of the things President Obama has said afterwards, I frankly don't believe is entirely true. I think there's a bit of historical revisionism, at least based on what I observed at the time. But the key reason, and this was not clear to all of us at the time, it became clear a couple of months later on, that part of the reason why he was very cautious in the beginning of that was because he was really focused on seeing if he could get some sort of a deal, which of course ended up being the failed negotiations on the Tehran research reactor. But that was all based on the idea that the Iranians were asking for fuel pads and the US saw an opportunity to see if a negotiation could be started on that.
Okay, thank you. I started the conversation with you, and I want to end it with you too. One major criticism is that many Iranians simply don't trust your analysis, even when some of it turns out to be correct, because they don't see you as an independent person. So please tell me directly, what's one solid reason an Iranian viewer should trust you, and what's the biggest misunderstanding about you?
I have to say, I'm not entirely clear exactly what some of those perceptions are, but I think you have to judge the analysis based on its merits. And as you pointed out, a lot of different things that I've said have turned out to be correct. When it comes to independence, I think actually I'm one of the most independent people in Washington, D.C., because my think tank is not funded by the weapons industry. It's not funded by any countries in the Persian Gulf who otherwise are funding tons of different think tanks in Washington. Is certainly not funded by the Israelis or any other foreign government. So when it comes to the perception that exists in Washington, in regards to the Quincy Institute, for instance, it is actually one of the most independent think tanks in the country, precisely because of the fact of the degree of transparency we have of where our funding is coming from, and the fact that we don't take any government funding and we don't take any funding from the defense industry in the United States.